So today we've got a bit of a treat. We're going to be talking about the Defiant, the Boulton-Paul Defiant aircraft. One of the sort of forgotten fighters in a way of the Battle of Britain. And to help me with this one, I've got my very old friend Andy Long, who has an absolutely encyclopaedic knowledge of the Defiant, and we'll talk to Andy and talk about all of that in due course. And of course the Defiant is a very interesting aeroplane because you can see this model and the image on the screen that this is a single seat fighter with the same engine in 1940 that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane, a Rolls-Royce Merlin. But the Defiant has a turret at the back, so it's much heavier. This turret is heavy, it's got an extra crew member, and there's quite a few misconceptions as well about the Defiant that we'll cover this afternoon. But that's the Defiant turret with 4 Browning machine guns in the back. No forward firing, wing mounted armament. And there's a Defiant, one of Andy's photos. Where's that?
It's probably taken at Martlesham Heath. Life magazine did a press day,
Right.
and 264 Squadron did a practice scramble for them for the cameras.
Lovely. And my interest in Defiant really was when I did Battle of Britain 1940, which is the book about casualties that came out recently. I really wanted to include a Defiant crew. So the ones that I chose were Pilot Officer Harold Goodall and his gunner, Sergeant Young, who was a New Zealander, emphasising that sort of contribution made by the Empire and Commonwealth men. So they were on 264 Squadron, involved in an action on the 26th of August 1940 off the Thames Estuary and off the South Kentish coast. And a couple of 3 years ago, there was a Dornier 17 bomber recovered off the Goodwin Sands, which is now being conserved at the RAF Museum. And there's been a lot of talk about this aircraft being identified as a particular machine that was in this action attacked by this Defiant squadron, and that it could have been Goodall and Young who shot it down. Having researched it in detail, and you'd have to read the chapter in the book because that's for another time, I'm not convinced. I'm not even convinced that the aircraft's been identified properly, and there's all kinds of issues with the Goodwin Sands at the moment, being dredged and so on, and obviously there's all these missing aircrew out there from various nations, and there's a big campaign running at the moment to try and prevent this happening, and perhaps rightly so. So that's just a little bit there about my recent interest in the Defiant. But Andy and I go back a very long way, since I walked into Trevor Badley's model shop in Worcester back in about 1980. 81, I would think, 81,
early 80s,
81. And there was a poster on the wall saying that Andy Long wanted to start the Worcester Aviation Archaeology Club, and I thought, well, I'll have some of that. And I contacted Andy, and it was with great surprise that I told him and virtually apologised for only being about 20 at the time. And Andy, I think you were 14.
Yeah, 14.
So we go back a very long way, because neither of us are 14 or 19 anymore, sadly. But there we are. So we've worked together for years. Andy is a very experienced researcher, and I was pleased some years ago now to publish Andy's book, The Faithful Few, which was about Worcestershire's fighter pilots. So now Andy has got well hooked on the Defiant, and you've researched it for years. So why the Defiant, Andy? What fires you up about the Defiant, mate?
I think it's quite an interesting story because you've got a quintessentially British design that, rightly or wrongly, is still being lambasted to this day. It has good parts to the story, has bad parts to the story. It is also what you could almost say a bit of an underdog story. But what I also like is the stories behind the Defiant and the air crews that flew it. my interest started from when I actually wrote The Faithful Few, because there's a chapter in there on a Defiant crew from 141 Squadron, a guy called Dennis Williams, who's from Bromsgrove. And that's what first opened my eyes to the exploits of the Defiant crew. And it's been a natural progression from that point to get to the point I am now. Here.
So what we're talking about is a story, again, another story that needs to be told, and it's never really been told properly, has it? So now there's this misconception about the Defiant being unsuccessful. You just pass me that model over around here. Let's have a look at that. It's a lovely model. This is the Airfix 148, is it?
Yeah.
Note to self, must make that. I like that. So you've got this gun turret there, and the misconception is that the Defiant didn't have the ability to fire forwards. Now, is that true or not?
No, it always had the ability. The system was always set that the pilot did, if needed, have the ability to actually deploy the turret and fire the guns. However, it relied on the air gunner to actually turn the turret into the forward position, lock it, and there was a master switch which could be set from pilot to gunner. Master switch would be flipped to pilot, thereby the pilot would have the ability to fire the gun the same way as on the Spitfire and Hurricane, spade grip with a button on it. But it could only be fired in forward if the guns were elevated at a minimum of 22 degrees above the horizontal to actually clear the prop arm.
Right. Oh, right. Okay. So it couldn't be synchronised to fire through it.
No, and there was no gun sight.
Right.
The only suggestion, and this was Dowding who came up with the suggestion, for it to be used in a slightly like a oblique way, aiming he suggested using either the framing of the canopy roof or actually painting on aiming lines on the person.
A bit like Charge Music.
Yeah,
the German
very much so.
Upward firing cannon.
Yeah. It had the ability to do it, but to be honest, I haven't found any instances of it actually being used. No.
I think the problem at the end of the day is, even though then technically that turret could be positioned forward and the guns could fire forward, as Andy says, there's no gun sight available for that, and the guns have got to be elevated at 20 degrees, so they're not on the horizontal plane, and that's going to make life difficult. And you haven't got time to be messing about doing this, have you?
Yeah.
In modern fighter combat at this time, with these new low-wing monoplane fighters, things were moving much faster in the air than they ever had before. And the idea of the Defiant stemmed from the Bristol fighter, of course, from the First World War, the biplane that had a pilot and a rear gunner. And it was an extremely successful aircraft, wasn't it, the Bristol fighter? But the problem you've got with this is the speeds that these aircraft are reaching, and the manoeuvrability is far greater and far superior than those aircraft in the First World War. So to have, you need instant hand-to-eye coordination, do you not?
Yeah, you do.
So with a Spitfire or Hurricane, you've got a pilot or a Messerschmitt 109, and it's thought to movement, isn't it? Simple as that, translated within a nanosecond. And with this, you just didn't have that fluidity and efficiency, and it's as simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of the pilot having to put himself into the position to benefit, not himself, but the air gunner sat behind him. When the Defiant was first introduced, there was some element of reluctance to actually fly the type by these highly experienced single-seat fighter pilots, because all of a sudden they're losing their freedom, and now they're having to more or less fly for the ability of an individual sat behind them, who isn't a flyer, isn't an air gunner, and also when in the start of the war, when rank and social standing, etc., was very, very big, sometimes you would have some very experienced pilots with a leading aircraftsman air gunner, because they at the time they didn't have the broad brush of bare minimum sergeant air gunners. So you would have that disparity. So there was an element of unpopularity there, because some of these guys just felt that they were losing their freedom.
Right. Okay. So so talk me through it then. So the Defiant, we've got the operations over the continent, haven't we, to start with? So tell us about that.
When the Germans launched their invasion, 264 Squadron, they'd formed in late 1939, and they were actually brought down and flew out from what is now Norwich Airport.
Right.
And their first engagement was as what they would call a composite squadron, because Dowding had suggested one of the best ways for a Defiant to work successfully would be part of a composite squadron. Never on its own, you should never dogfight, you should have some support from Spitz or Hurricanes. And the first engagement, composite squadron, was 66 Squadron. They flew out in formation. 66 Squadron liked the idea of the Defiant actually being at the back of the formation so the gunners could cover the rear end. When they did go into action, it was a little bit of a hodgepodge, and I think the set area attacks, because they had 4 set area attacks for attacking enemy aircraft, I think they were actually forgotten on the day. And but subsequently, the first kills were a Heinkorn 11 and Ju-88 by Philip Hunter and Nicholas Cook, and they were quite elated over the fact that first combat they brought down 2 bombers. Excellent. Following day, they went out. 6 went out, and 1 came back.
So in that first combat, the sense I'm picking up is they didn't encounter any Messerschmitt 109s.
No. They got themselves in amongst a few bombers, and that's how they luck. But this was near Rotterdam the following day, and they came up against elements of JG-26. Once again, they were with Spitfires. There was a flight of Stukas. 66 Squadron, I think it went straight for the Stukas, and then the 109s came down, and I say they lost 5 out of 6. One of the Defiants was actually dogfighting with a pair of Stukas, and the air gunner and the pilot survived, but it was the air gunner was a Canadian guy called Elmer Hatfield, and he thought his pilot was dead, and he had to extract himself at the last minute out through the top of the turret. He managed to deploy his parachute, but his pilot in the end actually managed to force land it into a Dutch canal and was taken prisoner of war. But Elmer Hatfield made it back, but was tragically killed not long after with a new pilot. Yeah, so it was a wake up call, and it was a bit sobering for them, because when they come back after getting a mauling on their second operational flight, there was a congratulatory telegram from Boulton-Paul saying, "Well done on your first kills."
Previous day.
Yeah, so in 24 hours they've gone from being very keen that we've got our first kills, and then they've met their first fighters, and it's really knocked them back a little bit.
I think so.
So. But then that started the period of when, because Defiant had some good range on it, so flying out into support of British forces in the Low Countries and Dunkirk, and of course they still had losses, but it was how do you put it? I think they were a bit more disciplined after that. They had an exceptionally good CO in the guise of Philip Hunter, who had with the Air Fighting Development Unit, HQ Fighter Command, designed their set attacks, where they would either approach from the either side of formations. They would actually cross in front, or there was ones where they would actually go underneath and actually fire from below, firing up, and also they like to deploy the defensive circle, a bit like the Messerschmitt 110, and they would actually get into a self-supporting circle, and they would actually descend.
That makes sense, but of course, when we're talking about the fighter command book of tactics, that's what happened to it. because it was all written before the war, before there's any experience, and it all went out the window, didn't it? Because nothing was as it was anticipated to be with these aeroplanes. So I'm not surprised to hear that the Defiants had the same problem.
Yeah. I mean, when you look back, the design, when the design was for specification was first laid out, it was pretty much aimed at an aircraft that was going to encounter bombers alone, because they never really envisaged the fall of the Low Countries and that you would have escorted bombers over here. And it was the principle of the bomber will always get through.
Exactly.
That's another thing. But you often read about little comments online and say, well, whoever was in charge of designing at Boulton-Paul, what were they doing? Not putting wing guns in it. Why wasn't wing guns put in? And on simple grounds is the specification never actually called for wing guns. Didn't call for them. It thought that the turret would be the tool for the job. And the turret itself, I mean, a lot of people don't realise it's actually a French design.
Yeah.
And the it's like.
Did Fraser Nash is it the turret?
No, it's actually a French company, SAM.
Right.
I can't remember. It's a long way, but it's
it's French.
It's from the original design was French, and it was offered at the same time. The design was offered for sale to Boulton-Paul and Fraser Nash, and JD North from Boulton-Paul. He straight away he went straight out to Paris, and with some financial backing from the Air Ministry, purchased the rights for this turret. And in fact, the turret manufacturers were actually quite advanced, even to the stage where that they were even toying with a cannon armed turret. But yeah, I mean the turret came first before the actual Defiant did.
Quite a thing. So of course we do hear, don't we, about over Dunkirk the Defiant had some success because the German fighters mistook it, not unsurprisingly really, for a Spitfire or a Hurricane and attacked from behind, and were surprised to get a good dose of 303 machine gun bullets. So tell us about some of those operations.
Well, I mean those operations, they where the actual story comes about them being mistaken for Hurricanes. The first reference to that was on, it's referred to as Day of the Defiance, 29th of May, where 264 Squadron over two sorties claimed a total of 37 enemy aircraft. People argue about the totals, but the claims were made in good faith. However, this is where the first recorded instance of the idea of them being mistaken. It's actually by Fred Barker, who was the most successful Defiant air gunner of the war, actually put in his combat report when some 109s came down on their stern, and he actually said, I think they mistook us for Hurricanes. And then the next thing you know, there's another reference in the 264 Squadron Operational Records book at the end of May 1940, and they list 6 points. It's like 6 things we have learned this month, and it actually says one of them is the enemy mistook. Sure, the enemy mistook us at times for Hurricanes, and I think it's a case of it could have been something in it. If Fred Barker had actually thought, mate, because the way they were coming in, he was in that turret, I wasn't. And has actually got under the opinion that they might have done. I think there is some element of truth in it. Some element of truth in it. And also, Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst, he actually said when they came back into Manston, and he actually said, what's happened? Did they mistake you for Hurricanes or something? Like a jovial, flippant style of remark.
Well, it's understandable. So what about then, we go then from that situation, the 109 soon wised up to this, didn't they? And the Defiants had a hard time after that in daylight. So then we come to the slaughter of the innocent. So let's talk about that. Tell us about that.
Right, obviously this slaughter of the innocents is 141 Squadron. It's the second Defiant Squadron. Firstly, 141 had formed in the start of the war as a Blenheim unit. Then they were equipped with Gladiators, and then in April 1940 they were re-equipped with Defiants. And throughout 264's combat time over Europe, 141 were actually up in Scotland patrolling, doing convoy patrols, and were pretty raw. And then eventually in July, they were moved down into 12 group, and they flew, I think it was about 68 sorties, down onto the south coast, didn't encounter anything. And then on July the 19th, they were at West Malling, ordered forward to Hawkinge, and they scrambled from Hawkinge. And it was a bit of a hodgepodge affair, because there was like a mix of A flight, B flight, 3 aircraft. They got 9 airborne. A 10th followed and couldn't catch up and turned back. 2 went technical, and you've got formation which is now so a mixed bag. You've got Hugh Tamlin, who would be later served with 242 Squadron with Sandy Powell. They took off with 2 functioning 303s.
Right.
They've been ordered out over the Channel, and then they were vectored again, and this is like 5,000 feet, 20 miles off Cap Greenau, and they were supposed to be meeting another squadron.
Right.
I don't know whether it's Spips or Hurricanes, but the intelligence report says they're supposed to be meeting another squadron, and this squadron never showed. They were at 5,000 feet, and then flying up sun from them, JG-51, and some very notable experienced aces. And it's probably, you're talking about 20 to 25 109s. And they pulled a bounce on the flight. And they were flying Vic line astern. And they came down, and sometimes you read things that they didn't notice the coming attack. They made no effort to make Malcolm Loudon, who was one of the flight commanders, actually spotted them, but spotted them too late. And they actually pulled the squadron into a tight left-hand climbing turn. But on that first pass, they lost 2 Defiants. And one thing about the Defiant I seem to see is that if it was hit well, it actually would catch light quite well.
It must be very difficult to get out of that little turret as well.
I would say that
I wouldn't fancy it.
no, so in fact, it was a different time when anybody's physical size, you could be a Defiant airgun, and you actually didn't actually sit right down in it. You were actually sat much higher.
Right.
I think egress out of one of them is better than what people actually think. But then again, once the G-forces kick in,
well, it's a whole different story. Yeah.
But but all 141. I mean, say they unfortunately got a mauling.
So how many did they lose that day?
Well, they lost in aircrew terms. They lost 10 aircrew. They lost 4 pilots, killed or missing 6 air gunners.
Wow.
The little Defiant that you've got there is Ian Donald, who was one of the flight commanders, and Arthur Hamilton was one of the 2 squadron gunnery leaders.
Right.
And they were so severely damaged, he ordered Arthur Hamilton to bail out off Dover, and Arthur Hamilton actually drowned.
Oh, God.
And he was trying to get back to Hawkinge.
Right.
And he just couldn't keep it in the air any longer, and it actually crashed a place called Elmsfield Road, and he was killed. But yeah, I mean, that single sortie started alarm bells ringing. That why has this happened? Now, SDO was one guy called William Richardson, exceptionally experienced pre-war pilot, aerobatic team pilot. Flew a lot out of Kenley. In July 1940, he got over 1,800 flying hours. Highly experienced, but I think he fell into the category of wasn't really too keen on the old Defiant. And to this day, he's lambasted, but people say he didn't take on board the advice that apparently was given to him by Philip Hunter. However, in 1943, Boulton-Paul wrote their own little internal report on their Defiant, and they make a telling note saying that, making reference to this slaughter of the innocents, and it alludes to the fact that they didn't perform as well because he didn't have anything passed on to him by Philip Hunter, because it almost says that the 2 didn't meet.
Right.
People say they did meet, people say they didn't meet, but Boulton-Paul allude to the fact that they didn't, because Philip Hunter was killed on the 24th of August, and so that's where they. But I take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt.
But I mean, to be fair, the exchange of information between squadrons during the Battle of Britain wasn't great, and the sharing of knowledge about tactics and so on. I guess there wasn't time because, for example, you know, you'd have a squadron from the north sent down south to relieve a combat shattered squadron, and they'd be in their cockpits and gone. You know, so there wasn't time for a briefing or changeover period. It may have been the same kind of thing, but so ultimately then the Defiant is battered in the Battle of Britain in daylight, and it's withdrawn, isn't it? It's withdrawn from the daylight battle. So it then and hence I guess why this aircraft is painted black, and I don't know whether you can see, but it's got little aerials all over it. Now, what are they, Andy, and why is it painted black?
Oh, that particular kit is to represent when they were developing radar for the Defiant, the fighter interception unit. When 264 they came back into 12 group, they had a very, very short time in 12 group. They came out of Curtin and Lindsay. They went into Hornchurch, and then really on the few operations that they flew, and they suffered casualties at the end of August. They had the heart ripped out of them, and to put it quite basically, it was they lost aircrew, they lost aircraft, and it reached the point where the Air Ministry pulled them out, sent them back to Curtin in Lindsay, and I think it was a case of what are we going to do with the Defiant now, because the losses were so acceptable.
There's a parallel story here as well, isn't there? Because by the end of September 1940, the Germans are unable to continue sustaining such heavy losses to their bomber force. So the Heinkel 111 is moved over completely to night bombing, isn't it? And this is really the start of the Blitz. Yeah. So we've got a parallel story there, and as it happens, the Defiant, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, they're not designed as night flying aircraft, were they? They were designed as daylight interceptors.
The Defiant was the specification was for an aircraft to be used by day and night. But when the Airfighting Development Unit were actually going through the setup when they were working out of Northolt, they concentrated purely on the day element, because time constraints and reliability constraints at the time. So they really haven't looked at it as a night fighter. But the ability was always there, but it got moved from day into night. But it was something that it could do.
That's right, exactly. Because the point is that the Spitfire and the Hurricane, they were both used at night, which was not intended, but it was a necessary expedient, because at this time there is no dedicated night fighting aircraft. The Bristol Beaufighter, a twin-engine Bristol Beaufighter, is turning up into the squadrons in September 1940, but airborne interception radar hasn't been sorted. The Blenheim is pressed into the nocturnal fighting role, but again, the Blenheim is not a dedicated night fighting aircraft, even though it did very well. And the airborne interception radar needs developing, and this is mainly because, and probably a lot of people don't realise this, when a German aircraft have passed incoming over the English coastline, there's no radar plot then. The radar was looking ahead, so it was looking at build-ups over France, the approach from France. Once it's gone over the coastline, can't track it. And that was the idea, airborne interception radar fitted to the aircraft. So you've got a radar operator, air gunner, who's also got this box of tricks to work with, and that's then being controlled by a ground control station that's appended to the radar, and it took time, didn't it, to do all of this. So the Spitfire, they're being used at night on what were called fighter nights. They would be sent up en masse with certain patrol lines through searchlight gates in London to guide them. But the Spitfire's not a great night flying aircraft because it's got narrow track undercarriage, so the landings could be a bit tricky, and you've got that great big nose in front of you and glowing exhaust stubs. And the Hurricane was better for night flying because it's got a wider track undercarriage, which makes it more stable and it's a bit more forgiving. But even so, you've got those glowing exhausts, and you've got the glowing exhaust issue with the Defiant as well, haven't you?
Yeah.
But like you say, so the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, they're still needed in daylight. The Defiant isn't, so the Defiant is really going to join the Blenheim now in a stopgap night fighting role, and it did it quite well. Didn't
it did it superbly well. I mean, it started off prior to when they started equipping some of the Defiants with radar. It operated in a thing called a cat's eyes role.
Yeah.
They were scrambled off. They were vectored in as close as they could to a plot on while it was still on the radar, and then the pilot would search visually, and they might pick up the glow of the exhaust or what have you. And some of these Defiant pilots at night, you read the combat reports, and sometimes they would like formate on it within 30 yards before the gunner was in a position to open fire, and they would actually, if they got close enough, and some of these gunners could actually bring aircraft down with minimal rounds. 141 Squadron destroyed their first night kills in September 1940 after they'd been brought back down from Scotland, and they started operating out of Gatwick.
Right.
And one example, they shot down a Ju-88 over Maidstone, and the pilot got, once again, within 30 yards. Air gunner put rounds into the cockpit, and he used 35 rounds per 303.
Wow.
And the actual Ju-88 nearly took them out because it actually flipped over the top of them, disappeared off one of the wings, then broke up in midair. But it really found its role really on night interceptions, and it was the best performing night fighter at the time, and. One of the other reasons, it had the support of Trafford Leigh-Mallory, because in World War I he was a night fighter pilot. He flew at night, and I think he was very, very protective of 264 because he was 12 group, and they were his 12 group boys.
I think certainly that everybody who knows about the story has got nothing but admiration, respect, and sympathy for the Defiant crews who fought by day over the continent and the French coast during Operation Dynamo, the Dunkirk evacuation, and subsequently the Battle of Britain. But what the Defiant is remembered for positively is its night fighting role, isn't it? So it's a good job we had the Defiant, because we've got the Spitfire and the Hurricane by day, and by night now we've really got the Blenheim, the twin engine Blenheim, and the Defiant. So it kind of came good for the Defiant. I mean, it's ironic really that Goodall and Young, who I wrote about in Battle of Britain 1940, they survived all of those daylight battles, and sadly they were actually killed at night in October 1940 before the Battle of Britain ended, intercepting a German bomber which shot them down. So it's quite ironic really, and very sad. But you brought some actual bits of a Defiant aircraft here. So here's some more. I absolutely love this, the tangible history, to be able to actually touch something that's really what it was. So tell us all about this, Andy, and show us your bits.
Right. These items here, I mean, generously given by Nick Wotherspoon and Eric Watkins from the Lancashire Aircraft Investigation Team. Right. And they recovered a Defiant that had one stage flown with 151 Squadron. And if you've read about Defiant and you've seen various illustrations, you will see that there is one famous Defiant that had a shark's mouth painted on it. That was N3328. And these items are actually from N3328 when it was lost serving later with an air gunnery school being fed. That comes from the Merlin. That's the top of the vacuum pump from the Merlin itself. This little item might not look too significant, but that is the actual pilot's lamp. The port side actually have the lamp.
Oh, the rubber's still in perfect condition.
Yeah. And the
grommet there,
yeah.
it perishes all, isn't it?
And when you think of some individuals who may have actually used that during night operations, got a large electrical bank connector here with the old wiring sections
and things to go in there. And
but this aircraft was actually recovered by say your Lancashire Aircraft Investigation Team, and a lot of the wreckage, including prop hub, prop blades. They also recovered the control column. A lot of stuff, and it's actually on display at Hangar 42 up in Blackpool.
Right, that's Lytham St Anne's.
Lytham St Anne's, yeah.
Excellent setup. My friend Glenn Galder's a volunteer there.
Yeah, and
excellent setup.
Yeah, I do recommend it. There's a little section in there where a lot of stuff is actually on display. So if you are that way and you're that way inclined, please go and have a look. We've got also
what's this other big lump here?
This bit. To be honest, I'm trying to work out what this one is, but it's a set of electrical connectors. And there's almost like either timer or a ratchet release in the actual box itself.
Wow.
But that would actually need a little bit more investigation. But hefty.
And it's worth making the point that there's no Defiant flying today. We've got a Defiant, a black painted Defiant that belongs to the RAF Museum that is currently on show at Royal Air Force Museum, Cosford in the Midlands, and down at the Kent Battle of Britain Museum at Hawkinge, we've got a nice replica Defiant that's painted in the green and brown camouflage of the daylight Battle of Britain fighting. But apart from that, I think that's it, Andy, isn't it?
Wow.
And I don't think there's much hope of this being restored to flying condition, to be fair.
Definitely.
So don't hold your breath waiting to see a Defiant. So there was something else there you were going to show us, I think.
Let me see what else I've got in the old magic box. Part of a filter arrangement there with the elements still in it.
Wow, check it out. Wow, it's in very good condition, seeing as it was recovered quite recently.
Yeah,
so that it's quite a story, the Defiant story in some, isn't it? And now you're writing the book for Pen and Sword. It's going to be published by Pen and Sword. Eagerly awaited, eagerly awaited by all of us.
Yes.
So, when's it going to be ready? Tell us, when's it ready?
I'm hoping you'll get it sorted by manuscript finally all done and dusted with all the photos. Probably mid-November now. That's the way I'm looking at it.
Okay, so
because I've got some stuff that a lot of stuff that I've already written. Some of it, to be brutally honest, I've gone back through. I haven't been too happy with it, so I've been editing a bit, chopping and changing. And I've also been given to unpublished Defiant memoirs,
right,
which are superb, and I want to try and include some of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
While I've got it, and as you know, through various issues, I actually haven't got it out in time, but on one side of the coin, it's actually proved to be a bit of a godsend, because I've been approached by people and they say, it's not too late, I've got this photo for you.
Well, I can guarantee when the book comes out, you'll be contacted by loads of people with loads more information, because it always happens.
Yeah.
But with a book like that, it is eagerly awaited, long awaited. There's a very big need for that book, especially knowing Andy's idea. I mean, you can appreciate the volume of knowledge that the man's got. So translating that from here and from all of these sources into the written word, I know isn't easy, and it takes time, and it's got to be right. And because of the detail I know that you go into things over, that makes it more difficult still, because it is a story that needs telling in detail, and it needs telling properly, doesn't it?
Because I think one of the things, the way it's working is that the way it's broken down is going to be sections on the actual idea, the prototype, section on the actual turret itself and air gunnery, section on the idea of the gunnery leaders, because I want to include a section in there about how air gunners became gunnery leaders in Defiant units, and what they had to do at the Central Gunnery School to actually pass the gunnery leader course. So I think that is a valuable part, because you often read about gunnery leaders. When it comes to night fighting, I'm pulling a little bit from the Night Defence of Great Britain minutes, which obviously they were looking at this day by day by day. How can we improve night fighting against the enemy? So, and the Defiant obviously plays a big part in that. So I've pulled from that. I've also gone into the actual when they finished operations as fighters, covering target tugs. Its stint as electronic warfare with 515 Squadron, which a lot of people don't really know, that they had a second wind in 1942 on moonshine operations, spoofing German radar. That was 515 Squadron. And some people also don't realise that Martin Baker used a Defiant as a test bed for its first ejection seat trial.
So it's fair to say that this book is comprehensive.
No, it should be chunky, to say the least.
Yeah, good. Well, let's get it done. Let's get it out there. I can't wait to see it. I've heard about this project for years. So, I'm looking forward to actually seeing it. And in fact, while you're here, I don't think you ever signed that for me, so I need to get you to sign it for me.
I will do.
Anyway, there we are, folks. That's the Defiant, the Boulton-Paul Defiant. A story that's rarely told, and undertold, I think, is right, because it's such an interesting story. It really is, and here's the man that's going to tell it properly. I've covered it in Battle of Britain 1940 with the Goodall and Young story, and there's a bit of an overview of Defiant operations up to that point in there. But this is going to be something totally different, a proper encyclopaedic look at the Defiant and just about every aspect of it from what I can see. So thanks for coming to talk to us, Andy.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the chat as always, and happy days. You were talking about moonshine earlier on. I think we ought to go and have some. Thanks, folks.
Cheers.